Hi, I'm Brayden Ruskowski, here to talk to you about my learning throughout the year in ECS 410, my initial assessment philosophy. So at the start of the year, my initial assessment philosophy has changed throughout the course of the year. In the beginning, my assessment philosophy was that I believed assessment is the way we as teachers help to give feedback to students on their progress, letting them reflect, and giving pieces that will be valued on with a meaningful grade and feedback provided. To me, the feedback portion is most important to allow students to know where they're at and how they can improve their assignments or improve for next time. The best practices for assessment are to provide meaningful feedback, allow time for students to reflect, allow time for them to question and inquire about their thoughts. This will allow the students the full capabilities of letting us know what they still need help on. Furthermore, we need to make sure that we are meeting students' various learning strengths, or what Howard Gardner in 1987 called learning intelligences, when looking at ways to assess. By doing this, we are enabling our students to show their achievement of the outcomes through their strengths rather than their weaknesses. Effective ways to link instruction and class into assessment is to allow class time to talk about the assignments and give time to provide feedback for the students and let them know what they have to get done. Additionally, providing time to journal so you know where they are at. Make everything you do in class time be involved in what they will actually be assessed on at the end. So, how has this assessment philosophy changed over the course of the class? Through the readings and course material, there has been many changes to the ways I approach assessment. First off, at the beginning, I never even thought of doing peer and self-assessment in my class, as I never really knew it was done in high schools. In all honesty, when I first heard about it, I never really thought students would take it seriously, but from class, my pre-internship, and in the readings, I can see how wrong I was. From an article by Dachi and McDowell, 1997, it showed that self and peer assessment are able to encourage students to continuously engage with the content and foster a deeper approach to learning. At the beginning of the year, I thought I had a handle on assessment and what it was supposed to look like, but little did I know how much more I need to learn. I saw how assessment needs to be on the achievement of the outcomes, had to focus on students' strengths, on their learning intelligences, and that we need to build on students' inquiring minds and touch on the higher orders of thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. In many cases, I could be called one of those individuals that could be considered assessment illiterate. The reason behind this is that I never knew as much as I thought, just basing around how I need to go off of the verbs used in the outcomes to know what assessment pieces to start with. Additionally, everything that goes behind assessment and all the factors at play, which is shown in an article by Vellante in 2006, that includes being student-centered, alignment to the curriculum, use of multiple methods, student skills, and the need to eliminate bias from the teacher. A couple more things that we need to think about when assessing is in an article by Brown, Sally, and ETAL, which was in 2004, that shows 16 values of assessment, including how it should be valid, reliable, and transparent, which are the main ones. So the article by Brown, Sally, and ETAL 2004 further talks about why we assess, what are we assessing, and when we should assess. All of these include many factors that we need to consider when making our assessments. By looking at some of the factors, I can see how much more complex and difficult assessment will be to have the best pieces given out to my students, as there are so many factors to consider which need to be met. What is assessment? In an article, so throughout the year I learned many different definitions of assessment, so I'm just going to let you know some of these. So in an article by Dachi and McDowell, the biggest change that has occurred over the years with assessment is that it is now used as a tool for learning instead of the traditional sense of the means to determine measures. So by Nisbet in 1993, they defined the term authentic assessment as methods of assessment which influence teaching and learning positively in ways which contribute to realizing educational objectives requiring realistic or authentic tasks, to contribute to realizing educational objectives requiring realistic or authentic tasks, to be performed and focusing on relevant content and skill, essentially similar to the tasks involved in the regular learning process in the classroom. That was on page 35 of that article. By looking at the curriculum in Wellness 10, 2012, assessment is a systematic collection of information about students' learning with respect to achievement of provincial curricular outcomes, effectiveness of teaching strategies employed, and student self-reflection on learning. Assessment is further broken down in the Wellness 10 curriculum, incorporating assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. So assessment for learning involves the use of information about student progress to support and improve student learning, inform instructional practices, and is teacher-driven for student, teacher, and parent use, and occurs throughout the teaching and learning process using a variety of tools, and engages teachers in providing differentiated instruction, feedback to the students to enhance their learning, and information to parents to support the learning. So assessment as learning is the actively involved student's reflection on learning and monitoring of her/his progress, and supports students in critically analyzing learning related to curricular outcomes, is student-driven with teacher guidance, and occurs throughout the learning process. Assessment of learning involves teachers' use of evidence of student learning to make judgments about student achievement and provides opportunities to report evidence of achievement related to curricular outcomes, and it occurs at the end of a learning cycle using a variety of tools and provides the foundation for discussions on placement or promotion. Next, we have how do we know that a student understands, knows, and is able to do something? So we know when students understand, know, and are able to do something when we use assessment that can be both done formatively and summatively. When checking in with the students through formative assessment, we can check in and see if they understand and able to do something by questioning, providing exit slips, green light method, fist of 5, and so on, just to check in with the students on what you need to help them with, which are all formative assessments. You could even allow them to reflect on what they learned through a journal and read those to see if they're getting that concept or achieving that outcome in a way. So looking at the summative assessment side is where you use an assignment with a tool such as a rubric, success criteria, checklist, etc. to evaluate the students on the outcomes being assessed, and will ultimately show if the students understand, know, and are able to do something with the content taught. In an article by Brown, Sally, ETL in the 2004 article, it showed that often at times students do not understand the learning outcomes until they perform tasks or are assessed with feedback. Will they understand the learning outcomes? That's very interesting. So the next thing we're going to talk about is my underlying assumptions that might inform my decisions about assessment and evaluation in classrooms. How can we work to disrupt these assumptions? My assumptions to assessment and evaluation that might inform my decision in the classroom could be based on bias from the students that are engaged and active in the class versus the ones that just sit there and maybe even disrupt the class. Even other areas that might not even I might not even know about towards the bias towards should be addressed, because I can't always know what everything I think of bias and the groups and people that are in my class. So the ways we can go about stopping this is through an article by Volante, who wrote an article that says that blind testing is a good method when possible, mean to not look at the person's names. Another great method is just reflect on the grades that you gave to make sure you're not favoring certain students or groups in your class. Personally, I believe the best way to get away from bias is to have good assessments that do not allow for teacher interpretations. Another assumption we might assumption we might make is that if we clarify with one person in class, that does not mean you should move on as there are at least 20 other students in the class. This means that we could make sure to have formative assessments that allow for the whole class to speak, so you get the general consensus of your class on where they're at. One more assumption that we might make on assessment evaluation, or I might make, is that the students have the prior knowledge in order to hit these outcomes, but it may not be that case at all times, since they might be new or come from a different place. This could cause a large disconnect with the students and may cause some students to pull away from school. The best way to make sure this does not happen is to have formative assessments and make the class a student-centered approach, so you know where they're at. In Volante's article, they talk about having a pre-test assessment to test the student's knowledge, which can allow you to adjust what you have to teach or adjust the test to meet the student's needs or the different tools that you use, as you don't always want to use traditional forms of assessment. The article also states if they can revise instruction based on prior assessment results, and also to allow for peer and self-assessment, so the students can assess their learning and be engaged with the evaluation process. This will allow students to get the idea of where they are at, what they need to fix in their assignment, and know if they need to ask for further help from a peer or even your teacher. My understanding is the role of non-traditional / alternative forms of assessment in the classroom. This is the next part. So throughout the course, I've seen how important it is to get away from traditional assessment that includes standardized testing, essays, and so forth, as they only focus on certain strengths. And we know that from Howard Gardner, the 1987 article, that there are multiple intelligences in play when working with students. This shows that students have strengths and weaknesses, and it is our job to use various methods and tools of assessment that meet the students' needs. Even in the 21st century competencies, documented by the Ontario Public Service 2016, they see the varying amount of skills and abilities that the students need to be taught to the students, which go from 3 broad categories of cognitive, interpersonal, and interpersonal domains to being more specific. All of these show the many different competencies that need to be taught to the students, as well as to help build on those students' strengths and weaknesses, in knowing that we need to help build them and on their strengths, as the curriculum talks about, because we need to build them on the strengths and not their weaknesses, because the curriculum doesn't talk about the achievement and outcomes, how they achieve the outcomes, but just that they achieve them, right, in a certain way. It doesn't tell you that. So just from my point of view, we do not need to specifically target linguistic side of thought, because if the student's stronger in kinesthetics, we should be showing the achievement of the outcome in that sense, because that's where they succeed, and that's the best way that they can show us that they achieve that outcome. Another non-traditional / alternative forms of assessment are important, as they can build inquiring minds of the students and base themselves around the many competencies, literacies, and learning intelligences that needs to be taught and learned, as well as building on the higher order of thinkings of Bloom's taxonomy rather than those lower levels of thinking, which the traditional assessment does at most times. So what modes, if any, can you envision incorporating into your own classroom? The modes of assessment that I can envision incorporating in my classroom when I begin teaching are having inquiry projects that allow students to think for themselves and be more of a facilitator during those projects, rather than teacher-centered. This can create the student-centered approach to do inquiry projects that we talk about earlier in the article by Volante, 2006. I feel that allowing students to do inquiry projects will allow them to pick a topic that they may enjoy, and will then allow them to be more involved in school and develop their higher order level thinking of Bloom's taxonomy. I also believe inquiry projects allows the students to express themselves in the way that they feel they can be the most successful at, which will show the students' best work. Furthermore, I want to use any mode that can incorporate multiple intelligences, so the students can have the best opportunity to express themselves in as I want to see that they achieve the outcome and not making them do it in a certain or specific way. For these modes of assessment, I will have to make sure to have rubrics and success criteria or other assessment tools that are more generalized to allow for students to express themselves in multiple ways. When looking at the tools for assessment, I can see that I will definitely use rubrics for assessing my students, as they are an easy way to back up your grades and are a nice layout that students know exactly what they need to have in their assignment. Furthermore, that there are so many types and ways to use a rubric that was shown in week 5 on February 11th in our class, that included the different holistic and analytic rubrics that we can use while showing both their advantages and disadvantages. Even though some say that analytic rubrics make it hard for students from trying new ideas or that they just do the work, I still really like them. The reason behind this is that it is easy to give feedback to help the students. They know exactly what they are being assessed on, and I can make them specific but general enough to allow for differentiation in how they present their information. They also allow for less teacher interpretation of marks, which is always great. Another rubric I will use is a checklist, but this will be more of for a formative assessment, being self or peer assessment, to allow the students to see if they have got everything they need to the assignment, and then allow them to see what level they are at on the rubric in regards to what they have checked off. This will allow them to cross-reference. So what barriers do you anticipate to doing so? So in doing inquiry projects, I can see how students may respond to these assignments, as they are not used to these, so they might have troubles picking a topic or not having strict guidelines to follow like most traditional and even contemporary assignments today have them. From this, there also be fooling around or students just not doing anything during their class time, as they are having troubles adjusting to this work, but will come with time. Honestly, in my mind, I see how this change will be hard, as going from tests, which are the using of lower levels blooms and being more set in stone what is expected, and going to inquiry projects where you're developing higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and there's less structure with more of a student-based approach than teaching-centered. So yes, this will be hard for students to get around, as it is a total new world for them, but is a much needed change and is only for the better. I also believe that having modes that touch on different competencies and multiple intelligences can be good to allow for all students to succeed, instead of those traditional approaches where only the linguistic and logical gifted students were excelling. The barriers to this are that students are so used to only using those intelligences that there will be backlash from the students and confusion as to why they are doing this assignment. From this, we need to make sure to teach the students how all students are different, and some students will learn better in these settings, which allow for more equity in the school. This could even be a good time to show them some of the comic strips or different pictures explaining equity to the students, so they can see the importance of doing those different assessments. Overall, using both of these methods will allow for students to use higher order thinking skills and allow for all students to have more equal opportunity to succeed in their school. Thanks for watching.